In 1876, a 21-year-old salesman named Warne Gates rented a plaza in the middle of San Antonio, Texas. He had been watching a medicine show performer work the crowd earlier that day, and he borrowed the showman's technique. Gates strung thin wire between wooden posts right there in the public square, forming a small corral in front of a growing crowd of skeptical Texas ranchers. Then he had cowboys drive a herd of wild longhorn cattle straight into it. These were not gentle dairy cows. Texas longhorns were half-feral animals that weighed over 1,000 pounds each and carried horns wide enough to gore a man from 3 feet away. The ranchers watching expected the cattle to tear through the wire in seconds. The longhorns charged the fence, hit the barbs, felt them bite into their hides, and pulled back. They tried again. The wire held. They milled around inside the corral, confused and bleeding slightly. But they did not break through. By the time the sun went down over San Antonio, Gates had more orders than any factory in the country could fill. He reportedly told the crowd his product was light as air, stronger than whiskey, and cheap as dirt. That salesman would later earn the nickname Better Million Gates for his legendary gambling habits, and he would go on to help found the company that eventually became Texaco. But the wire he was selling that afternoon would prove far more consequential than anything else in his career, because that wire was about to fence an entire continent, and the consequences would be far darker than anyone standing in that plaza could have predicted. 3 years before Gates put on that show, the wire had not existed in any useful form. 3 decades after it, there would be almost no unfenced land left between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. The speed of that transformation is almost hard to believe, and so is the trail of wreckage it left behind. But the problem barbed wire solved had been growing for decades before Glidden ever filed a patent. By the middle of the 1800s, the Great Plains of the United States were the center of one of the largest land disputes in human history. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres of public land to any citizen willing to settle it, build a home, and work the soil for 5 years. Hundreds of thousands of families packed wagons and moved west to claim their share. They built sod houses because there was no timber. They plowed the prairie grass and planted wheat and corn. And then they ran into a problem that nearly broke the whole system. They could not fence their land. The plains had almost no trees. When the landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted visited the region in the 1850s, he described it as a sea of grasses that moved in swells after a great storm. Beautiful to look at, but absolutely useless for building fences. If you wanted to fence your 160 acres with wood, you had to buy lumber, shipped by rail from forests hundreds of miles to the east. The cost of that lumber often exceeded the value of the land itself. Some settlers tried growing hedge fences out of Osage orange bushes, but those took 3 to 5 years to mature and still left gaps that a determined cow could push through. Smooth wire fences were cheap, but cattle leaned against them, stretched them out, and walked right over them. So here was the situation. Farmers planted crops, and free-roaming cattle belonging to ranchers trampled and ate those crops, and there was almost nothing anyone could do about it. The ranchers had their own problem. They needed to keep their herds together, define their grazing territory, and separate their animals from competing outfits. Everybody needed a fence. Nobody had one that worked. The United States Department of Agriculture estimated that the country had roughly $200 million invested in fencing by 1872, and most of it was failing. That changed at a county fair in DeKalb, Illinois, in September of 1873. A farmer named Henry Rose from the nearby town of Waterman had a booth where he displayed a device he had recently patented. It was a thin wooden rail with sharp metal spikes driven through it, designed to hang from an existing smooth wire fence. The idea was straightforward. When a cow leaned against the fence, the spikes would prick the animal and teach it to stay back. 3 men stood in that crowd, shoulder to shoulder, studying the display. Joseph Glidden was a 60-year-old farmer who worked 1,500 acres west of town. Isaac Elwood owned the local hardware store and ran auctions on the side. Jacob Haish was a lumber merchant and building contractor. Each of them looked at Rose's contraption and had the same thought. The wooden rail was clumsy and expensive. The barbs should be on the wire itself. Over the next few months, all three men raced to improve the idea. Joseph Glidden worked in his barn with materials he found around the farm. He used a hand-cranked coffee grinder to twist short lengths of wire into sharp points. His early attempts kept sliding along the smooth wire, bunching up at one end instead of staying spread out. Then he figured out the solution. He wrapped a barb around one strand of smooth wire, then twisted a second strand around the first. That double twist locked each barb firmly in place so it could never slide. He called his design the winner. On October 27, 1873, Glidden filed his patent application with the United States Patent Office. The patent was granted just over a year later, on November 24, 1874, when Glidden was 61 years old. Isaac Elwood had been developing his own version, but when he saw what Glidden had built, he recognized it was better than his. Elwood bought a half interest in the patent for $265, and the two men formed the Barbed Fence Company. They set up manufacturing in a small two-story building in DeKalb with about 70 workers. Jacob Haish, the lumber dealer, patented his own barbed wire design and launched a legal war against Glidden that dragged on for nearly 20 years. It reached the United States Supreme Court in 1892, and the court ruled that Joseph Glidden was the rightful inventor. What happened next in the market was one of the fastest commercial explosions of the 19th century. In 1874, the first year of production, Glidden and Elwood produced about 10,000 pounds of barbed wire, most of it twisted by hand. The demand blindsided them. When Glidden received an order for 100 tons, he was so stunned that he telegraphed the buyer asking if the order should have read 100 pounds. It should not have. By 1875, they had built their first steam-powered factory. By 1876, commercial production hit 1,500 tons. And by 1880, just 6 years after the patent was granted, more than 80 million pounds of barbed wire had been sold across the United States. That number kept climbing. Bessemer steel made the raw material cheap, and manufacturing improvements drove the price per 100 pounds from $20 in 1874 to $10 in 1880 to under $2 by 1897. By 1900, annual production had reached 200,000 tons. By 1910, wooden fences had essentially vanished from the American plains. 2,000 pounds of barbed wire made 2 miles of 3-strand fence. A farmer could haul the supplies in a single wagon and string the wire across a quarter section in a day or two. At under 2 cents a foot, it was the cheapest and most durable fencing material anyone had ever seen. But the people who had thrived on the unfenced range saw something very different when they looked at that wire. Cowboys called it the devil's rope, and they meant it. For the men who worked cattle on the open plains, barbed wire was the end of everything they knew. The open range had been the backbone of the Texas cattle industry since before the Civil War. Cowboys drove herds hundreds of miles north along trails like the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving, pushing cattle from South Texas ranches to railheads in Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas. A trail boss would hire a crew of a dozen cowboys, round up a herd of 2,000 or 3,000 longhorns, and spend 2 or 3 months on the trail, sleeping under the sky, crossing rivers, and surviving stampedes. The land between South Texas and Kansas was unfenced. The grass was free, and if you could round up cattle and move them to market, you could build a life. Barbed wire shut all of that down in just a few years. Trails that had been open for decades were suddenly blocked by fences. Waterholes that any passing herd could drink from were enclosed behind wire. Grazing land that had been shared by custom, if not by law, was carved into private parcels and sealed off. A cowboy who had ridden the same route for 10 years would find a fence across it one morning with no warning and no detour. The cattle themselves suffered in the wire. Longhorns that pushed against barbed fences got deep gashes that turned into festering infections in the Texas heat. Horses shied away from fences they could barely see, especially at dusk. Even ranchers who adopted the wire had to deal with constant veterinary problems in their own stock. Those who refused to use it watched their available range shrink month by month as every neighbor around them strung more lines. Within the span of a single decade, the cattle drive, which had defined the American West in the popular imagination and in reality, was finished. The last major drive on the Chisholm Trail took place in 1884. By 1890, the open range was functionally closed. The tension over fencing erupted into open violence in the summer and fall of 1883, when Texas went to war over wire. A severe drought had already pushed cattlemen to the breaking point. The open grazing land was vanishing behind fences, and what remained was drying up under a merciless sun. Ranchers without land of their own could not find water or grass for their herds, and they blamed the fences. At first, the fence cutting was targeted. People snipped wire that blocked public roads, or that enclosed waterholes everyone depended on, or that sealed off land belonging to other people. Because some of the large cattle operations had fenced not only their own property, but also public land, small farms, and even schoolhouses and churches, cutting off access to buildings that entire communities used. But the cutting spread fast and became indiscriminate. Groups of men organized into secret night riding bands with names like the Owls and the Javelinas. They wore disguises, posted armed lookouts, and cut miles of fence in a single raid. If the wire went back up, they came back and cut it again. In some counties, fence cutters tacked threatening notices to the posts, warning landowners not to rebuild. By the fall of 1883, fence cutting had been reported in more than half the counties in Texas. The total damage was estimated at $20 million, a staggering sum for the time. 3 men died in separate confrontations over fences in Brown County. On one ranch near Robert Lee, in Coke County, fence cutters burned posts and wire worth $6,000 in a single night. Governor John Ireland called a special session of the state legislature in January of 1884 to deal with the crisis. The lawmakers passed 2 bills. The first made fence cutting a felony, punishable by 1 to 5 years in prison. The second made it illegal to fence public land or block public roads with wire. It was a compromise. The big ranchers could keep their legal fences, but they could no longer swallow public land behind them. The Texas Rangers rode out to enforce the new laws, and the worst of the violence subsided. But sporadic fence cutting continued for nearly a decade after that, flaring up again whenever drought dried out the remaining open range. The fence cutters had lost the war. Some of them went broke and moved to cities. Others eventually channeled their anger into politics, joining the Farmers Alliance and the Populist Party, and later the Texas Socialist Party. The men who had ridden out at night with wire cutters in their saddlebags became some of the earliest voices for working-class politics in a state that would later be known for something very different. The wire stayed, and then the wire demonstrated a capacity for destruction that nobody had planned for. In 1882, ranchers across the Texas Panhandle began building a drift fence to stop cattle from migrating south during winter storms. On the northern plains, when an Arctic cold front blew down from Canada in what Texans called a blue norther, cattle would instinctively turn their backs to the wind and walk south until they found shelter in a canyon or behind the steep banks of a creek. The drift fence was supposed to hold them in place. By 1885, the fence stretched roughly 200 miles across the northern panhandle. From deep into New Mexico all the way east to the Indian Territory border, it was 4 strands of barbed wire strung between cedar posts, with repair camps spaced along its length. In late December of 1885, a series of blizzards hit the southern plains with a ferocity no one had seen in years. The temperature dropped well below zero. Snow and wind blasted across the flatlands with nothing to slow them down. Cattle by the thousands turned south and started walking. They walked until they hit the wire, and they stopped because the fence would not let them pass. More animals arrived behind them. The herds packed tighter and tighter against the fence, crushing the animals in front against the barbs. Those that were not trampled or sliced open by the wire froze to death standing up. Others starved in place, unable to move forward or turn back. When the storms finally broke in January of 1886, cowboys rode out to check the fence, and found a scene they never forgot. Thousands of cattle lay dead along the drift fence, piled against the wire in drifts that stretched for miles. One cowboy described walking across the frozen carcasses for miles at a stretch, stepping from one dead animal to the next without ever touching the ground. Some ranchers in the Panhandle estimated they lost 75% of their herds in that single winter. The event became known as the Big Die-Up, and it shattered some of the biggest cattle operations in West Texas. But the deepest wound barbed wire inflicted was not on cattle or cowboys. It was on the people who had lived on the plains for thousands of years before any of them arrived. Before white settlement, an estimated 60 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. For centuries, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Lakota, Blackfeet, Ponca, Cree, and dozens of other nations had followed those herds. The buffalo provided everything: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings. The relationship between the tribes and the herds was the foundation of an entire civilization. By the 1870s, that relationship was already under siege. Commercial hide hunters were slaughtering buffalo by the hundreds of thousands for their skins, which sold for about $3.50 apiece. The United States government, meanwhile, saw the destruction of the buffalo as a deliberate strategy to break the resistance of the Plains tribes and force them onto reservations. Barbed wire made the destruction permanent. The endless lines of fence cut across ancient migration routes that buffalo had followed since the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago. Herds that once moved freely across hundreds of miles were blocked from reaching water and grazing land. Settlers planted crops behind their new fences, replacing the grass the buffalo depended on. The numbers tell the story as plainly as anything can. Before settlement, roughly 60 million buffalo across the plains. By the mid-1880s, the herds were gone from most of the West. By the end of the century, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remained in all of North America. Some settlers at the time could not believe the animals were really gone and insisted the herds had migrated to Canada and would return. Native Americans drew on their traditions and believed the buffalo had gone underground and would reappear when the right prayers were offered. Neither was true. The herds were finished, and with them went everything they had sustained. Barbed wire was not the only cause. The railroads, the commercial hunters, the United States Army, and federal policy all contributed. But the wire was the instrument that physically divided the land into private parcels and made it impossible for the open plains to exist again. Once the fence was up, what had been there before could not come back. While all of this was happening on the American frontier, the Invention was already crossing the Atlantic. Military officers had recognized barbed wire's potential as early as the 1880s. British Army manuals included instructions for laying barbed wire perimeters by 1888. American forces used it in the Spanish-American War. But nothing prepared the world for what barbed wire would become in the trenches of World War I. When the Western Front settled into a stalemate in the fall of 1914, both sides began digging in. And in front of those trenches, they strung the same wire that had been designed to keep cattle out of cornfields. The scale was staggering. The trench system stretched nearly 1,300 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. In front of nearly every section of trench, on both sides, barbed wire entanglements spread into the wasteland soldiers called no man's land. Some entanglements were knee-high, meant to trip men running in the dark. Others stood 6 feet tall and extended dozens of feet deep. On Germany's fortified Hindenburg Line, wire obstacles reached up to 300 feet out from the trench, making a frontal assault on foot virtually suicidal. The wire used in the trenches was not the same as ranch fencing. Military wire carried more barbs per foot, spaced tighter together, and it was laid in dense, overlapping tangles designed to trap a soldier in the open long enough for a machine gunner to find him. Some entanglements were arranged to funnel attacking infantry into narrow gaps, channeling them directly into the sights of machine gun nests. There was an entire military science devoted to the placement of barbed wire obstacles. An invention created to manage livestock on a family farm had become one of the most feared defensive weapons on the planet. Serving on a wiring party was one of the most terrifying assignments in the entire war. Teams of soldiers crawled out of their trenches at night, drove stakes into the frozen ground with rubber mallets wrapped in blankets to muffle the sound, and strung fresh wire in total darkness. If a flare went up, they dropped flat and held perfectly still, sometimes lying directly on the barbs, while enemy guns swept the area around them. In sections where the opposing trenches were only 100 yards apart, wiring parties from both sides occasionally stumbled into each other in the dark. Before a major offensive, soldiers with wire cutters were sent out to open paths through the enemy's entanglements. It was slow, exposed, terrifying work, and the casualty rates were enormous. Commanders tried shelling the wire with artillery before infantry assaults, but the bombardments often failed. Explosions tossed the wire into the air and dropped it back down in tangled masses that were even harder to get through than the original barriers. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British artillery pounded the German wire for a full week before sending troops across. The wire was still there. Hundreds of soldiers were cut down trying to get through it, and their bodies hung in the entanglements afterward. British troops sang a grim, sarcastic song about their missing comrades that ended with the old battalion hanging on the old barbed wire. The wealth that barbed wire generated was as enormous as its consequences. Joseph Glidden became one of the richest men in the state of Illinois. He donated the land that became the campus of what is now Northern Illinois University. Isaac Elwood built a palatial mansion in DeKalb that still stands today and can be visited as a museum. The city itself adopted the nickname Barb City, and the local high school teams are still called the Barbs. Glidden lived to be 93 years old, dying in 1906 in the same town where he had first twisted wire around a coffee grinder more than 30 years earlier. The patent wars around his invention were fierce and long. Between 1868 and the mid-1890s, the United States Patent Office received more than 500 separate barbed wire designs. Many were legitimate improvements. Many more were transparent attempts to get around Glidden's patent and sell knockoff wire. Unlicensed barbed wire, sometimes called moonshine wire, flooded the market. The legal battles generated enormous fees for lawyers and enormous profits for whoever held the rights to the winner. Washburn and Moen, the Massachusetts wire manufacturer that bought Glidden's manufacturing stake in 1876, grew into one of the largest industrial companies in the country. John Warne Gates, the showman from the San Antonio demonstration, built his own competing wire empire, formed the Consolidated Steel and Wire Company, and eventually tangled with J.P. Morgan himself for control of the American steel industry. Morgan's United States Steel Corporation eventually absorbed most of the competition, turning barbed wire manufacturing into one of the many threads woven into the industrial consolidation of the Gilded Age. The thing that makes this entire story so striking is the distance between what Glidden intended and what his invention actually did. He was not trying to reshape a continent. He was not trying to end a way of life or build a weapon. He was a 61-year-old farmer in Illinois trying to keep cows out of his wife Lucinda's garden. He used a coffee grinder and some spare wire and solved a practical problem on a 1,500-acre farm. The design itself was almost absurdly simple. 2 wires twisted together with sharp points locked between them. A child could understand how it worked. Glidden himself once described it by saying, "It takes no room, exhausts no soil, shades no vegetation, is proof against high winds, makes no snowdrifts, and is both durable and cheap." He was right about all of that. What he could not have foreseen was what would happen when you gave millions of people a cheap, permanent way to draw lines on the land. Within a single generation, the Great Plains went from an unbroken grassland shared by millions of animals and thousands of people to a grid of fenced farms and ranches. The open range closed, the cattle drives ended, the buffalo vanished, and the same wire crossed the ocean to become one of the defining instruments of industrialized warfare. Drive through any rural county in the United States today, and you will see barbed wire lining both sides of the road for miles at a stretch. It is one of the most manufactured metal products on Earth, and it is so ordinary that most people look right past it without a second thought. Every strand of that wire is doing exactly what Joseph Glidden designed it to do back in DeKalb, Illinois, keeping livestock in and keeping everything else out. What nobody at that county fair in 1873 could have known was how far that principle would reach, or how many lives it would cost, or how completely it would rearrange a continent. It all started with a farmer looking at a piece of wood with some nails hammered through it and saying out loud that the barbs should be on the wire. If this video taught you something you did not know, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which part of the story surprised you the most. And if you found it interesting, give it a like so we can keep making videos like this one.